So welcome back everyone to another lecture. Well, let us first basically recap what we learned in the last lecture. Okay, so in the last lecture we started with classes. We said that a class is basically a blueprint or a template. In other words, a class is also a data type. So a data type in the sense that instead of the data types such as integer, double, float, etc., a class is one such data type that you create yourself. Then we learned about how to create objects from classes. So objects are also called instances. So we saw to declare a variable, we first use the data type followed by an identifier. And to declare an object, we do basically a reference of an object, we do the same thing. We first write the data type. So as I said previously, our class is a data type followed by an identifier. So this identifier could have been your name as well. And then when we assign a variable to a primitive data type such as integer, we just write equal to some value. Whereas with objects, we have to use a new keyword. So we talked about it extensively in the last lecture. We said that the new keyword dynamically allocates space in your memory where your object is created, right? And I briefly said that these parentheses are used to indicate constructors. So we'll talk about constructors later. So this was basically an overview of the last lecture. Okay. So for today's lecture, I want to start off with what is called methods. So to declare a method, so let me first give a use case for this method. So let me again create an object. Let me call this object 1, new box. Okay, so I've created a box object. So this is object 1, and object 1 is a box object. So again, let me ask you this. If I were to print the value of object 1, what would I get? Well, the answer is I would get a reference, since new creates an object and this object is present in memory, and what object 1 holds is the reference to that object. In other words, a memory address. Okay, so I'm glad that's out of the way. So now imagine that I want to assign variables. So to be able to assign variables, we saw that we have to use the identifier name and then use a dot operator, and then we can assign any variable. So let's say I want to assign 5 to L length, or I want to assign 10 to height, and I want to assign say 2 to width, right? So we could have done that without any problems. Okay, so I forgot to write the 1 here in these 2 lines. So in this way we could have assigned variables to our length, height and width. Okay, so now imagine I want to create another box object. I would have to redo this all over again. To assign variables, to assign values to my class variables, I would have to again add this myself. Suppose I want to add 10, 11 and 12 respectively to my length, height and width. So this is kind of unintuitive. There's a lot of work going on here. So we could solve this using what is called a method. So with method declarations, you have to follow the same procedure. You have to first write an access modifier. So the only access modifier that we are aware of so far is public, private, or when we have absolutely nothing. So suppose we have no access modifier here in front of class. So it means the default access modifier is being used. So we can have an access modifier here to denote whether it is public or private, or we could have nothing to denote that it is the default access modifier. So for simplicity's sake, let's say that it is going to use a default access modifier. So I'm not going to use any access modifier. So if I type, first you have to write the access modifier. Then you have to write return type. So the return type means whether your method is going to return something or not. And finally, you're going to have to write the name of your method, followed by parenthesis. Parenthesis means brackets. Okay. So again, I said that I'm not going to use any access modifier, which means the default access modifier is going to get used. So I should now write the return type. So if a method does not return anything, suppose our main method here does not return anything, and hence we wrote this void here. So again, I'll talk about static later. So since this method is not going to return anything, I'm writing void here. And now let's give this method a name. So this method is basically going to set the dimensions of L, H and W. So let's call this set dim, or set dimensions for short. So I've now written the name of the method, and now let's write this. Let's write out the parentheses. So I've written out the parentheses, right? So now what I basically want to do is, I have created this method. Let me comment out these lines. So to call this method, I have to use the same convention that I was using to assign values to variables. So I could just write set dimensions, and in this way the method would have been called. So let me print something here. System.out.println set dim method. So as you can see, this method is being called here, whereas if I comment out this line, this method would no longer be called and I would not have gotten this print statement. Okay. So what I want to do here is that I want to set the dimensions. So basically this 5, 10, 12 that I was assigning to L, H and W respectively, I want to set this values or variables, or give these variables specific values using this method. So what I have to do is first include parameters. So parameters are values that your method can receive. So let's say my method wants to receive an integer variable I. So let's give this an integer variable value 10, or let's just use 5 since I was assigning 5 here. And let's just call this num. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to assign the value that was being given here in num to L. So I'll just write L equals to num. So again, the number that I've written here is known as an argument, and the int num variable that I've specified here is known as a parameter. So what is happening is that when I'm calling the set dimension method from the object that I had created previously, I'm now passing a value which is 5. So this 5 is going to get placed here in this variable num, and this num basically contains what? The variable 5. So what's going to happen is that this L is going to get this value 5 assigned. Okay, so now let's test if this works. System.out.println. Let's print the value of object 1L. So as you can see, when I passed 5, the value of 5 was set to L, and when I was calling the L variable from my object, that value was being printed. So now let me pass on all 3 variables here, 5, 10, 2, 5, 10, 2. So now since I'm passing 3 arguments here, again these are called arguments, I need to have 3 parameters as well. and these parameters must have the same data types as well. So let me write int num1 or int n1, n2, int n3. Okay, n1. Okay, so let me compile this. As you can see, the 5 that was being placed in L is being printed here. However, if I write 2.0 here, now this number becomes a floating point value. So let me try running this. As you can see, I'm getting an error here which says incompatible types. So possible Lucy conversion from double to int. So I am passing a double value here, but I am trying to receive that value inside an integer variable. I cannot do it. So I have to give this a double type. And if I were to run this again now, I would have no problems. Okay, so let's do the same for LH and W. W equals n3. So now let me print out the 3 class variables. So as you can see, they have all been placed to LH and W. So basically these 3 lines of code, the purpose that these 3 lines of code had, I am now being able to have the same purpose or carry out the same task using just this single line of code here. So let's create another object. So let's create box object 2. Again, let's call the set dimensions method and pass 10, 10, 10. Okay, so again I'm printing L, H and W here. So the question is, what do you think the output here is going to be? Well, as you can see, I'm getting 10, 10, 10 here, even though I'm calling object 1. As you can see, I had created object 2, but I had set object 1 here. So why am I still getting 10, 10 here? Well, as you can see, when I call the set dimensions method, I did not call it from object 2, I instead called it from object 1. So now if I change this to object 2, I would get the same results here as well as here. So let's try this. As you can see, I've gotten 5, 10, 2 here and 5, 10, 2 here. So again, we know that each object has their separate copies in memory. So this is something that I showed you guys diagrammatically in the last lecture. So now let's change this object to, and we'll have the appropriate results here. Okay, so basically this was a method that was used to set specific values to your class variables. Well, now what if you need now need to say calculate the volume of this box? So you need to do something like this: system.out.println, right? You need to do object L1 into object H into object W. So here you get, so looks like I missed out something, which is I misspelled print. Okay, so as you can see, 5 into 10 is 50 and 50 into 2 is 100, right? So in this way I can calculate the volume, but I would have to, when I want to say, suppose calculate the volume of box 2, I'd have to repeat a similar thing. Again, I would have to change this variables, basically the reference type, to get the volume for box 2. So can we do this same thing in a method? So let's call this method calculate, or let's just call this print volume. Okay, so the print volume method does not return anything. Print volume method should just print the volume. So therefore I'm going to call this, I'm going to give this a return type of void, and again void means that it is not going to return anything. So here print volume should just print out the volume. So I can just simply write L into H into W. So let me execute this code. Let me now call object1 dot print volume, this method. So as you can see, things have now gotten so much more convenient. By just calling a single method, I'm having the same result as this line here, where I had to manually write out the formula here. So imagine if this was a complicated formula such as the one that I gave you guys for your lab. You'd have to do so many calculations here, which would be really inconvenient. So by using a method, you're doing things much more efficiently. So again, for box 2, you could have done a similar thing. You could have just called the print volume method from object 2, and you'd have box 2 objects volume here, actually here. Okay, so that was methods, right? Well, now what if you need to actually use this volume? Suppose in my final result, what I wanted to show was that the volume plus a specific number, suppose it's a random number. Now let's just call this 12. Suppose I want to add the volume to 12 and then show that result, right? I want to add 12 to my volume, which is 112. So now you cannot do this with this print volume method anymore. Since your print volume method does not return anything, it just prints the volume. So now I want a method that returns the volume. So since all of these are integer variables, okay, so let me first briefly explain what happened when the print volume method was called. Well, when the print volume method was called, this line of code was executed, and this line of code printed the value of L into H into W. So L into L H W is here. So basically you were setting these values of L, H and W. Let me uncomment this here using set dimensions method. You are passing 5, 10 and 2 here. So you passed N was 5, N2 was 10 and N3 was 2. So here L equals to 5, H equals to 10 and W equals to 2. So what happened eventually was that the class variable L was assigned a value of 5, the class variable H was assigned a value of 10, and so on. And ultimately the multiplication of these results were printed out. So now what I'm saying is that I want a volume method that can actually return the volume. So since my products or my multiplicants are all integer, I can firmly say that my product or the result of my multiplication is going to be an integer as well. So now I'm giving a return type. So again, I'm not giving any access modifier here, which means that the default access modifier is being used. So I'm using a return type here, which is int. So now let me write the name of the method. So let's call this get volume. So this is the get volume method, and just let me have it return L, H and W. So now I can have this same line here, system.out.println object1 dot get volume. So when I now call get volume, it's going to return L into H into W values, basically 5 into 10 into 2. So as you can see, the print volume method and the system.out.println get volume method is doing the same thing. However, what I cannot do with the print volume method is add something to the volume. So basically I can add a variable or any other value to get volume like this. Now I'm getting 112. So suppose for ease of understanding, let me declare a variable called volume and let me place it here, and now I can just write something like this, volume plus 12, and I would get the same result. So this was basically methods in a nutshell. We learned about methods that did not return anything, methods that had parameters, methods that did not have any parameters, and methods that return something. So I will end this lecture here.